I'm Grace Whitman, 29 years old, and I'll never forget the sound my grandmother made when she realized her ticket was missing. We were standing at Gate B6, the crowd buzzing with laughter and rolling suitcases, and she clutched her boarding pass envelope like it might still save her. "Grace," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He said there wasn't one for me." My father turned his back before she could finish, as if erasing her from the picture. That was the day my family boarded a flight to Europe, leaving her behind. I stayed with her, and I never once regretted it. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever stood by someone everyone else chose to abandon. My story begins long before that Thanksgiving morning in a family where appearances were currency and affection came with fine print. My father Daniel built his world on granite countertops and open houses, always selling a dream he didn't live. My mother Evelyn measured worth by waistlines and social circles, always dressed for an audience that wasn't really watching. Our dinners looked perfect from the outside: crystal glasses, roasted salmon, polite laughter, but the silence underneath could chill you. Questions weren't welcome, only agreement, and the smallest crack in the image was treated like a scandal. In that house, love was conditional and silence was survival. But summers were different. When the school year ended, I'd pack my suitcase and drive to Meridian to stay with my grandmother Margaret. Her house smelled like cinnamon and lemon soap, the kind of clean that came from care, not money. She'd greet me at the door with her gardening gloves still on, cheeks flushed from the sun. Those months felt like a secret world, one where kindness wasn't a transaction. We baked bread that never rose quite right, played cards on the porch, and let the radio hum old Billie Holiday tunes through the open windows. She used to tell me, "Grace, life's not about what shines, it's about what holds." I didn't fully understand then, but I do now. As I grew older and built my own life as a nurse in Boise, Grandma's home became my refuge from everything false. I'd stop by after late shifts, still in scrubs, and she'd pour me a cup of chamomile tea without asking a single question. Her warmth made the long nights bearable. My parents, on the other hand, treated my career like an inconvenience. A nurse my mother once said, stirring her coffee without looking up, "Couldn't you have gone to medical school? You were always capable of more." I learned not to answer, just like I'd learned not to flinch when my father introduced me as our practical one. Practical was his polite word for disappointing. Grandma never spoke against them, but she didn't need to. Her quiet pride in me said everything they refused to. I noticed the way Dad's jaw tightened whenever she praised me, or how Mom's smile thinned when I chose to spend holidays in Meridian instead of Aspen. They'd tolerate it, call it sweet, but their tone made it sound like weakness. I used to tell myself they'd never hurt her, that even if they couldn't love deeply, they at least respected her. I was wrong. That year, Thanksgiving felt strange from the start. My parents arrived at Grandma's house with overpacked suitcases and a forced cheerfulness that didn't match the weathered warmth of her kitchen. The table was set with her best china, the air thick with cinnamon and roast turkey. I watched as my father poured her a glass of wine and started talking about family experiences and creating lasting memories. My Aunt Caroline chimed in, her smile sharp as a knife, painting pictures of Europe, Rome, Paris, London, as if love could be bought in hotel packages. Even my cousins looked up from their phones long enough to agree it sounded cool. Grandma listened quietly, her eyes wide behind her glasses, the way she used to look when she discovered something beautiful in an ordinary day. "Oh, I don't know if my knees could manage all that walking," she said softly. My father chuckled, all confidence and charm. "That's the beauty of it, Mom. We'll take it slow. You'll have your own seat, your own room. We just need a small deposit to get things started. The rest is handled." When I asked how much small meant, he said it so casually that it made my stomach twist. 20, just to cover bookings, my aunt added. "You've always wanted to see the world with your family, haven't you?" For a long moment, Grandma said nothing. Then she smiled, the kind of hopeful, trusting smile that still believed in second chances. "If it brings everyone together," she said, "then it's worth every penny." I should have said something. I should have told her that love bought under pressure was never love at all. But she looked happy, truly happy, and I couldn't bear to be the one to take that away. The next morning, I heard her on the phone with the bank giving out account numbers in her soft, trembling voice. When I asked if she was sure, she just patted my hand and said, "They finally want to include me, sweetheart. That's all I ever wanted." The morning of the flight, she was ready before anyone else. She wore her navy cardigan with gold buttons, and her black flats she called her travel shoes. Her suitcase was small, the kind you'd pack for a weekend, not 3 weeks abroad. "I packed light," she said proudly. I smiled back, pretending not to notice the pit forming in my stomach. At the airport, my father commanded the check-in process, like a man conducting business, not family. My aunt fussed over neck pillows, my mother fixed her lipstick, and Grandma trailed behind, looking around like a child seeing the world for the first time. When we reached the counter, the agent frowned. My father leaned in, whispering, his voice clipped and low. I caught fragments, not on the manifest system error, too late to fix. When Grandma asked what was happening, his answer came smooth, almost rehearsed. "Just a glitch, Mom. Nothing to worry about. But with the timing, it's best if you sit this one out." Aunt Caroline's voice followed, soft and poisonous. "Maybe it's for the best. The trip would be hard on you." Grandma's hands tightened around her suitcase handle. "But I paid," she whispered. My father gave a quick smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You did, and we're all going because of your generosity." Then he turned away just like that. No apology, no shame. Around us, families were hugging, boarding, taking pictures. We stood alone. Grandma looked at me with tears she wouldn't let fall. "There's no ticket for me," she said again, as if maybe she'd heard wrong. I took her hand. "Then I'm not going either." She tried to protest, but I shook my head. "Not without you." And as their plane lifted into the gray November sky, we walked back through the glass doors into the cold wind, 2 women left behind for the price of a promise that never existed. That night, she sat in her chair by the window, unpacking her small suitcase piece by piece. I brewed tea and watched her fold each sweater like she was packing away hope itself. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the heater and the faint crackle of the wind outside. She never said another word about the trip, but I saw the tremor in her hands as she laid her unused passport on the table. That was the moment I realized something I couldn't ignore. Love shouldn't leave bruises, even the invisible kind. Grandma didn't sleep that night. I could hear her footsteps moving softly across the hallway, then the creak of the chair by the window. When I went to check on her, the small lamp beside her glowed, and the suitcase she'd unpacked earlier sat open on the rug. Her folded sweaters were stacked neatly again, as if she couldn't decide whether to put them away or keep them ready just in case. She held her passport in one hand, her thumb brushing over the navy cover. "I should have known better," she murmured, more to herself than to me. I set her tea beside her and stayed quiet. She didn't need my words, she needed the silence to settle. By morning, her calm had hardened into something I couldn't name. She watered her roses as if nothing had happened, clipping away dead leaves with precise care. I stood on the porch, watching her, the November air, sharp enough to sting. My heart was still burning from what they'd done, but she seemed untouched, lost in the rhythm of trimming stems. When she saw me, she smiled. "You don't have to worry, sweetheart. They just got caught up in their plans. Families do foolish things sometimes." I wanted to tell her this wasn't foolish. It was cruel, but she looked so tired, I couldn't bring myself to say it. I made breakfast while she read the paper, the same one she used to clip crossword puzzles from. Everything felt normal, but I could feel the weight between us, that quiet understanding that something sacred had been broken. When she reached for her coffee, her hand trembled slightly, and I knew pretending wasn't enough anymore. "Grandma," I said softly, "you don't have to act like this is okay." She folded the newspaper, her eyes still gentle. "Grace, I've lived long enough to know people disappoint you, but I don't want you carrying that bitterness with me." I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "It's not bitterness, it's wrong, and I think someone needs to say it." That afternoon, when she went to rest, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The light from the window caught the steam rising from my mug, and for a long time I just stared at the blank search bar. Then I typed the words, "Elder Financial Abuse Laws, Idaho." The results poured in statistics, definitions, hotlines, stories that felt too familiar. One link caught my eye, Office of Elder Protection Boise Division. I clicked it. The page listed clear examples of exploitation: deceiving a senior into transferring funds, misrepresentation for personal gain coercion under false pretenses. Each phrase was a mirror reflecting what my father had done. I copied the contact number into my notebook and closed the laptop. The next morning I found Grandma in the garden again, wearing her knit gloves, humming softly as she pruned the rose bushes. I walked over with a mug of coffee and crouched beside her. "You don't have to pretend you're all right," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then back to the flowers. "I'm not pretending, honey. I just don't want to make it harder for you." I shook my head. "Doing nothing that's harder." She sighed, brushing petals from her lap. "They're still my children, and you're my family," I said quietly, "and I can't let them keep doing this to you." She didn't answer right away, but that night after she'd gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table again. The number I'd written down was still there right beside her old recipe cards. I dialed it before I could talk myself out of it. A receptionist transferred me to a lawyer named Victor Hensley. His voice was calm, steady, the kind that made you breathe a little slower. Tell me everything he said, and I did. I told him about the dinner, the promise, the airport, the empty envelope. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Grace, what you're describing sounds like financial exploitation. Would your grandmother be willing to meet with me?" The next afternoon he came by our house. He wasn't what I expected, no polished briefcase or stiff suit. He wore a gray blazer, dark jeans, and an expression that was both professional and kind. Grandma offered him tea before she even sat down. He thanked her and settled into the armchair across from her, his posture relaxed but attentive. "Mrs. Whitman," he began, "Grace has told me what happened at the airport. I understand this isn't easy, but I want to explain something clearly. What they did wasn't just hurtful. It may have been illegal." She shifted in her seat, eyes down on her cup. "I don't want any trouble. They're my family." Victor nodded. "I understand, but you have rights, and what they did meets the legal criteria for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." Her eyes flickered confusion, guilt, and something like shame. I leaned forward. "Grandma, you gave them that money because they promised you something they never meant to deliver. That isn't generosity, it's deception." Victor's voice stayed gentle. "With your permission, I can help you recover your funds and protect your estate. We'll need documentation, bank statements, and, if possible, witnesses who can confirm what happened." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she looked up at him, her back straight, her voice steady. "If Grace believes this is right, then I trust her." Victor gave a small nod. "That's all I need." The next few days passed quietly, but with purpose. Victor and I drove to her bank where the manager, Susan Cooper, recognized Grandma immediately. When we explained the situation, Susan's face drained of color. She printed out the statement showing a wire transfer for $20,000 to my father's account. She signed a note verifying the details and handed it over carefully. "I can't believe they did this," she whispered. Grandma just smiled politely and thanked her. From there, we went to the airport. We found the same airline agent who had checked us in that day, a young woman named Marissa Green. Her memory was sharp. "Oh, I remember her," she said, eyes narrowing. "Her son told us she wasn't well enough to fly. I thought it seemed cold. She looked so confused." Marissa agreed to provide a written statement describing what she saw. Each new piece of evidence felt like another thread being pulled from the web my father had spun. Back at Grandma's house, we sat at the dining table, sorting papers, scanning copies, labeling folders. The sound of the printer hummed softly, while Grandma made grilled cheese sandwiches for us in the kitchen. She pretended it was just another day, but I could see a quiet determination in the way she moved. When Victor used terms like civil case and revocation of inheritance, she didn't flinch. At one point, as she sliced tomatoes, she said almost to herself, "Maybe it's time they realized I'm not just some wallet in a rocking chair." Victor smiled and looked at me. "I'd say you're a pretty powerful woman, Mrs. Whitman." She laughed softly, her cheeks pink. "Well, I'm learning." Later that evening, after Victor left, Grandma sat on the porch while I cleaned up the papers. The sun was setting, washing the yard in gold. She called out, "Grace, come sit a minute." I joined her and she reached for my hand. "You know," she said, "I used to think keeping peace meant saying nothing." Maybe peace starts with telling the truth. I didn't know what to say, so I just squeezed her hand back. The roses beside the porch had lost their blooms for the season, but new buds were already forming small and stubborn against the chill. The following week, Victor stopped by again. He looked more serious this time, carrying a thicker folder under his arm. "We're ready," he said. I frowned. "Ready for what?" He met my eyes. "For when they come back." He'd pulled the travel itinerary booked with her money, of course. Their flight home was scheduled 3 weeks after they'd left. He outlined our plan calmly, as if it were any other case. We'd meet them at the airport when they returned, and he'd serve them the papers in person. Grandma didn't know. Victor said it was best that way. She deserved peace, not more confrontation. On the morning of their flight home, she was outside tending her rose bushes again, humming a tune I recognized from years ago. She handed me a short shopping list, milk sugar, and a new pair of pruning shears, and smiled unaware of where I was really going. When I drove toward Boise International that morning, the sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of quiet blue that looks almost fragile. I parked near the terminal, the manila folder sitting on the seat beside me. Victor met me at the gate, his expression calm but focused. He wore a dark suit this time, and the weight of the folder seemed heavier in his hand than before. "Are you ready?" he asked. I nodded. The hum of arriving passengers echoed through the terminal, a blur of voices and rolling bags. Then I saw them. My father at the front, his tan deepened from travel, dragging 2 large suitcases stamped with stickers from Paris and Rome. My mother followed, perfectly put together, as always, her hair smooth and nails freshly done. Aunt Caroline trailed behind, sunglasses perched high, her kids scrolling on their phones. They looked radiant, careless, untouched, until their eyes met mine. I stepped forward, Victor matching my pace. "Daniel Whitman," he said firmly. "Caroline Boyd." They both paused, confusion flickering across their faces. Victor handed each of them an envelope. My father took his with a frown. "What's this?" he demanded. "A legal notice of investigation," Victor replied evenly. "Financial exploitation of Margaret Whitman. You're required to respond within 7 business days." Aunt Caroline's mouth fell open. "You can't be serious." Victor's tone didn't change. "Failure to comply may result in a formal lawsuit." My father's voice rose. "Grace, what have you done?" I looked at him steady. "I'm protecting her. You made her believe you wanted to include her, and then you left her standing alone at that gate." My mother stepped forward, eyes flashing. "She's old, Grace. That trip would have been too hard on her." I met her gaze, but not hard on her bank account, apparently. For a long moment, no one spoke. The noise of the airport moved around us, but it felt like we were the only ones standing still. Aunt Caroline muttered something about me being dramatic, but Victor's calm voice cut through. "We'll see you in mediation." Then we turned and walked away. As the automatic doors opened, cold air swept across my face. Behind me, I could still feel their eyes following, stripped of confidence for the first time in my life. And in that quiet, I knew something had changed forever. Because this time, they weren't the ones walking away. When Victor filed the complaint, I didn't expect silence to feel this heavy. The days that followed were strangely calm. No calls, no messages, nothing from my parents or Aunt Caroline. It was as if they'd vanished into the same quiet they'd left Grandma in at that gate. But every evening, as the sun dipped behind her rose bushes, the stillness pressed harder. Grandma kept her routine, watering, cooking, humming, yet there was a distance now, a pause in her laughter that hadn't been there before. We both knew we were waiting for something, a reaction, an apology, anything that acknowledged what had been done. Instead, the silence grew roots. 2 weeks later, Victor called. They didn't respond, he said. His tone was even steady. "We're moving forward with a default ruling." I stood at the kitchen counter with the phone pressed to my ear, the smell of coffee still lingering. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means the court will rule in your grandmother's favor without their participation." He paused. "Restitution and additional penalties are possible. I'll keep you updated." I thanked him and hung up, staring at the phone long after the line went dead. When I told Grandma she was sitting at the table peeling apples for a pie, she probably wouldn't eat. She didn't look surprised. "So, it's official?" she asked. "Almost," I said. There'll be paperwork in the next few days. She nodded, kept peeling. The curl of each apple skin fell into the same neat pile. I never wanted it to come to this, she said quietly. Neither did I. We finished in silence. Later that night, I caught her staring at the envelope that had once held her boarding pass. It was still tucked in the corner of the mantel. She hadn't thrown it away. By the time the official documents arrived, the season had started to shift. The air carried that first edge of winter, the kind that makes wood creak in the walls. Victor came by in the afternoon, a thin folder tucked under his arm. He sat with Grandma and explained everything carefully, how the court had ordered the return of her money within 30 days, how inheritance claims were suspended pending review. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she took a long breath and said, "They really did this," not as disbelief, but as acknowledgement. She looked older in that moment, not weaker, just worn from the weight of truth finally set down. After Victor left, I brewed her a cup of tea and found her still at the table, turning the papers over in her hands. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," I said. She smiled faintly. "No, sweetheart. I'm sorry I let it go on this long." The words lingered between us. That night she made a phone call I hadn't expected. I heard her from the hallway, steady, polite, clear. "Mr. Hendricks," she said to her estate attorney, "I'd like to update my will." She didn't hesitate. "Yes. I want to remove Daniel and Caroline completely. No portion. They've had enough." When she hung up, she saw me standing in the doorway. "I'm not doing this out of anger," she said. "I just want peace. And peace means not giving people more chances to hurt you." I nodded. She wasn't bitter, just finished. The kind of finish that comes after years of forgiving people who never apologized. In the weeks that followed, she moved through her days with a steadier rhythm. We went to the bank and closed the old joint account she'd shared with my father. The manager, Susan, helped her set up a new protected trust, this time with only her name and mine listed. Grandma signed each paper carefully, her hand shaking just slightly. "I want you to be my financial advocate," she said. "If anything happens, you take care of things." I promised I would, but the way she said it made something ache deep inside me. It sounded like a handover. Afterward, we stopped for lunch at a small diner she liked on Main Street. She ordered soup and cornbread, humming along to the radio while we waited. For a moment, it felt like before just us, safe from the noise of the rest of the family. She reached across the table and patted my hand. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "You helped me see what I didn't want to." I squeezed her fingers gently. "You did that yourself." Life began to settle again, not perfectly, but peacefully. Grandma returned to her watercolor class at the community center. At first, she claimed it was just to keep busy, but soon her sketchbook started filling up with small, careful drawings, roses, hills, birds. One afternoon, she painted a single gate with a soft wash of gray and blue. When I asked about it, she smiled. "Just a memory," she said. The name she wrote at the bottom was Gate B6. Spring arrived late that year, bringing rain that soaked the garden and woke the tulips along the fence. Grandma watched them bloom from her porch, her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders. "You planted these for me," she said. "You said yellow means hope." I nodded. She smiled, her eyes bright but calm. "Then I guess we're both still learning to keep it." Sometimes letters arrived envelopes with familiar handwriting. My parents' Aunt Caroline. I'd find them in the mailbox, stacked neatly, as if the mailman knew not to bend them. Grandma never opened them. She'd slide them into a drawer labeled unanswered right beside her recipe cards. If they really wanted to change, she said once they'd start with action, not ink. The drawer filled slowly, quietly, like a record of every line she refused to cross again. Months passed, and the rhythm of our days became gentle. I'd work my shifts at the hospital, then stop by in the evenings to help with dinner or listen to her stories. She laughed more often now, especially when she talked about her painting class friends, Linda, who always painted birds that looked like potatoes, and Carol, who brought cookies no one actually liked but everyone pretended to. Those little stories filled the space where pain used to live. Then one chilly afternoon, she called me from her porch. "Grace, come look." I stepped outside, and she pointed toward the tulips swaying in the wind. "They're still standing," she said, her voice low but proud. "Even after all that rain." I nodded. "They always do." She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I think I'm finally starting over." That night, while I washed dishes, I realized I hadn't heard her say starting over in years. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building something new on solid ground. The house felt lighter even with the quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore. But peace, I was learning, doesn't stay still. It changes shape just like people do. And though Grandma didn't say it, I could sense she was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. Sometimes when I came home late, I'd see her through the window sitting in her chair by the lamp sketching, or just watching the shadows shift on the wall. She never brought up the lawsuit again, never asked whether they'd return the money. Victor confirmed it had been paid back in full, but Grandma didn't want to see the check. "Let it stay where it belongs," she said. "Out of my sight, out of my heart." I kept it in the file cabinet, sealed in an envelope marked "Resolved." By late summer, her watercolor of Gate B6 hung in the living room above the piano. Every time I looked at it, I thought of that day, the sound of the gate closing the cold air, the decision to stay beside her. It wasn't a picture of loss anymore. It was survival, captured in brushstrokes. As the leaves began to turn, Grandma's pace slowed, but her spirit didn't. She still met her friends for coffee at the cafe downtown, still mailed birthday cards with her looping handwriting. When she grew too tired to drive, I became her chauffeur, her grocery companion, her storyteller on long drives. She'd smile, her hand resting on mine. "You've always been my steady one," she said once, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know it then, but that fall would be our last full season together. The house, the garden, the tulips, all of it would soon carry her memory instead of her footsteps. And though I didn't yet understand how much that would change me, I felt it in the air that night, the beginning of another ending, quiet and inevitable, just beyond the porch light. Winter came early that year. Frost gathered along the window edges before Thanksgiving, and the mornings started with the hum of the heater instead of birdsong. Grandma moved a little slower, but she refused to stay still. She kept her painting schedule at the community center, even when I offered to drive her, instead of letting her walk from the parking lot. "I need to stretch these old legs," she'd say, clutching her canvas bag against the wind. Her steps were careful, measured, but her eyes were alive again. Watching her regain that light after everything made each cold morning feel worth it. I started visiting her class on my days off. The room smelled like coffee and acrylic paint, and the walls were covered with landscapes, rolling fields, barns, sunflowers. Her friends greeted me warmly, teasing that I looked just like her when she was younger. She always blushed and waved them off. One afternoon, as she rinsed her brushes, she said quietly, "You know, I didn't think I had anything left to learn. Turns out I was wrong." I asked what she meant. She smiled. "I thought the world stopped giving once you lost trust. But maybe it gives you new people to start again." Her recovery wasn't loud or quick. It was slow, like thawing ground after a long freeze. Some days, she spent hours sketching at the table by the window, the same place she'd unpacked that suitcase months ago. Other days, she baked too many cookies for neighbors, claiming she was testing recipes. The house smelled like cinnamon again, and for the first time in a long while, her laughter filled it. I could almost forget what had happened until a letter arrived. It came one gray morning tucked among bills and grocery flyers. The handwriting was familiar, my father's. Grandma found it before I did. She turned it over in her hands, studying the name like it belonged to a stranger. Then, without opening it, she slid it into her drawer, labeled unanswered. "He's not ready to say what matters," she said simply. I didn't argue. She'd made peace in her own way, and I wasn't going to reopen what she'd chosen to close. In January, Victor stopped by again to finalize a few documents related to the trust. Grandma greeted him like an old friend, insisting he take home half a pie she'd baked that morning. He laughed, reminding her that clients don't usually bake for their lawyers. "Then you haven't met enough grandmothers," she said. As they reviewed the final paperwork, I watched her sign her name with a steady hand. There was no hesitation this time, no guilt, just resolve. When Victor left, he shook her hand and said softly, "You've done something most people never find the courage to do. Set yourself free." She smiled, but didn't answer. February brought long stretches of quiet. Snow blanketed the garden, covering the tulip bed we'd planted last spring. On the coldest nights, I'd light the fireplace while she read. Sometimes she'd look up from her book and say things that caught me off guard. "Grace." She said one night I used to think my biggest mistake was not saving more money. Turns out it was giving too much trust. I looked at her, unsure how to respond. She closed the book gently. But you taught me something. You showed me that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's sacred. By March, the snow melted, leaving the soil damp and dark. She insisted on planting again despite the chill that still lingered. Tulips don't wait for perfect weather, she said, pressing bulbs into the ground. They trust the earth will catch them. I knelt beside her, helping smooth the soil over. The air smelled like thawed pine and wet dirt. It was the first time in months I saw her move with the same energy she used to have. The weeks that followed felt lighter. Grandma's painting class hosted a small exhibit at the library downtown. Her piece, the one she'd titled Gate B6, hung near the entrance. It showed a gate half open, the path beyond it fading into soft shades of gold and gray. People stopped to stare longer than they realized. Some asked about the title, but she never explained it. She didn't need to. I stood beside her that day, watching her smile, as a little girl pointed at the painting and whispered, "It looks peaceful." Grandma leaned down and said, "It is." After the exhibit, we went for coffee at the diner we both loved. The waitress, a cheerful woman named Tanya, asked if we were celebrating something. Grandma laughed softly. "You could say that. Freedom, maybe." Tanya smiled, jotting down our order. "That's the best thing to celebrate." Grandma stirred her coffee slowly, her eyes far away. "I think I've been carrying the wrong kind of memories," she said, "the kind that keep you from moving forward. Maybe it's time I carry the good ones instead." April brought new warmth. The tulips began to break through the soil, small green shoots that grew stronger each day. Grandma watched from the porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "You planted hope," she said, "and it came back." I smiled. "You kept it alive." She nodded, her eyes soft. "Maybe we both did." That same month, I received an acceptance letter from Idaho State University. I'd applied quietly, not wanting to tell her until I knew for sure. The program focused on gerontology and elder advocacy, exactly what had grown from this whole experience. When I showed her the letter, she pressed a hand to her chest. "You're going back to school." I nodded. "I want to help people like you, people who don't have anyone to speak for them." Her eyes glistened, but she smiled through it. "I always knew you'd take care of people. I just didn't know you'd start with me." She wanted to throw me a small dinner to celebrate. "Just the two of us," she said. She cooked roast chicken, baked her favorite peach cobbler, and set the table with the good china she usually saved for company. The meal was simple but perfect. We talked about everything except the past plans for my classes, her next painting, whether she should grow lavender that summer. By the time we finished dessert, she leaned back in her chair, satisfied. "I haven't felt this kind of peace in years," she said. "Real peace, not pretending." After dinner, we sat on the porch, watching the last bit of daylight fade. Fireflies blinked along the fence line. She reached over and rested her hand on mine. "Promise me something," she said. "Keep your life full of people who see you, not what you can give them." I nodded. "I will." She smiled a small, tired smile that felt like closure. "Good. Then I can rest easy." I didn't think much of it then, just another one of her quiet blessings. But later as I drove home, her words echoed louder in my mind than usual. There was something final in her tone, something that made the night air feel heavier. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself she was just being sentimental. The next morning she was in her chair by the window, a blanket draped over her legs, sketchbook open on her lap. She looked peaceful, her head tilted slightly to one side, pencil still resting in her hand. I stood there for a long time before I realized she wasn't asleep. We buried her on a soft April morning under the oak tree near the lake, the same place she'd once taken me for picnics as a child. The tulips around her home bloomed brighter that week than they ever had before. People from her painting class came. So did Susan from the bank, and Marissa from the airport, who sent flowers and a note that said, "She mattered." I placed a single yellow tulip on her grave, tied with a ribbon embroidered with her initials, M.W. When the last of the guests left, I stood there alone, the lake shimmering behind me. The breeze brushed against my cheek like a hand soft and familiar. I whispered, "Keep blooming, Grandma." And though she was gone, I felt her there in the wind, in the garden, in every act of courage she'd passed down to me. I didn't know what came next, but I knew where to start. The next morning, I opened my laptop, found my university email, and began my first orientation. Grandma's painting of Gate B6 hung above my desk, a reminder that sometimes peace isn't what you wait for, it's what you build, one brave step at a time. And somewhere beyond that gate, I knew she was finally free. The first spring without Grandma didn't arrive quietly. The tulips came up early that year, bold streaks of yellow and gold against the soft green of the yard. I still lived in her house, and every morning I'd make coffee, open the curtains, and wait for that same light she used to love the one that slipped through the lace and caught the edge of her sketchbook. The house was still but not empty. Her presence lived in every creak of the floorboards and the faint smell of lavender that never quite faded from her pillow. After the funeral, people had stopped by for weeks, neighbors bringing casseroles, women from her painting class delivering cards tied with ribbons, even Susan from the bank with flowers, and a note that read, "She taught me how to stand my ground." I kept them all on the kitchen counter, unable to throw any of it away. The house felt less like a place of grief and more like a keepsake of her life, one I was slowly learning how to care for. Classes at Idaho State started in May. The first morning I walked into the gerontology program's orientation, I felt like the oldest person there, even though most students were close to my age. They spoke in bursts, eager, polished, full of ambition. I sat near the back notebook, open pen steady, reminding myself that Grandma never rushed through anything worth learning. When the professor asked us to share why we'd chosen the program, I said only, because I know what it means when someone's taken advantage of, and what it takes to make that right. A few heads turned, but I didn't elaborate. The truth didn't need an audience. At night after studying, I'd sit on the porch with tea, watching the tulips sway under the porch light. The silence was a comfort now, not a wound. Sometimes I'd catch myself whispering to her the way I used to during drives home. I'd tell her about my classes, about Victor stopping by once to check on how I was doing, or how Marissa from the airport had written me an email saying she'd started volunteering with a senior support program in Boise. It felt like her kindness was still moving through the world, touching people I'd never even met. One afternoon in June, I got a call from Victor. His voice carried the same calm I remembered. "Grace," he said, "I wanted to let you know the estate process is officially complete. Everything's been transferred to the trust exactly as your grandmother wished." I thanked him, then hesitated. "Did they ever reach out?" He paused. "Your father's attorney filed a short objection months ago, but he withdrew it before the review. No further contact since." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "That's probably for the best." He agreed quietly, then said, "She'd be proud of you, you know. Not many people fight for justice without letting bitterness take over." When the call ended, I sat there in the dim light of the living room, holding the phone against my chest. Proud. The word felt like a small warmth settling back where it belonged. That summer, I volunteered at a local senior center as part of my coursework. The first day I walked in, the scent of disinfectant and coffee hit me like a memory. The director, a kind woman named Janet Morales, gave me a tour. "We're short-staffed," she said with a tired smile, "so any extra hands mean a lot." I spent the first few weeks organizing medication lists, helping with meal prep, and listening to stories that sounded too much like Grandma's. There was one woman, Eleanor, who reminded me of her sharp-witted gentle, with a stubborn streak that peeked through every so often. One afternoon, Eleanor told me her son had borrowed money to fix his business and hadn't called in 6 months. My stomach clenched. "Did you sign anything?" I asked softly. She shook her head. "No, but I think I know what you're getting at." I told her about the Elder Protection Office in Boise and gave her Victor's card. It felt like passing on a torch. The work was exhausting, but grounding. Each face I saw, each story I heard made Grandma's lesson clearer. Dignity wasn't just something you defended, once it was something you helped others hold on to every day. By July, I'd been asked to stay on part-time. Janet said, "You've got a way of making people feel seen. We could use that here." I accepted. And for the first time since Grandma's passing, the ache in my chest eased into something steady, like purpose taking root. At home, I began turning her spare room into an art space. The easel still stood by the window, her brushes cleaned and lined in a jar. I bought new watercolor paper and pinned her painting Gate B6 above the desk. It became my quiet ritual to sit there after long days, studying the soft lines and faded colors. The gate was half open, the light beyond it faint but warm. It no longer looked like a goodbye, it looked like an invitation. By late August, I received a letter from the Elder Justice Initiative in Washington, D.C. They'd reviewed my volunteer work and offered me an internship with their community outreach program. I almost didn't believe it at first. The position meant moving temporarily, but something about it felt right, like the next chapter Grandma had prepared me for without saying it. I drove to the cemetery the day I decided to accept. The oak tree above her grave cast long shadows across the grass, and the tulips I'd planted months ago had wilted into seed pods ready to bloom again next spring. I knelt down and brushed away a few leaves. "I got in," I whispered. "They're trusting me to keep doing what you started." The wind moved softly through the branches like her answer. When I told Victor about the offer, he smiled. "She'd call that a full circle," he said, turning pain into purpose. He offered to review the contract for me and helped arrange the transfer of my stipend through the trust. Before we hung up, he added, "You're not just carrying her legacy, Grace, you're expanding it." Packing for the move took longer than I thought. Every item in the house had a story. I kept her quilt, her sketchbook, and a small tin box of old photographs. The rest I organized into donations. Her books went to the library, her teacups to the community center kitchen, her extra art supplies to her old class. The night before I left, I sat on the porch with one last cup of tea. The crickets sang, and the house seemed to breathe with me, its silence no longer heavy, but full. The next morning, I locked the front door and tucked the key into an envelope for the property manager. The moving truck waited in the driveway. As I looked back one last time, the sun caught the tulip bed in a golden shimmer. I could almost see her there, standing in her cardigan, waving the way she used to when I left for work. The drive east was quiet. The road stretched out in long ribbons through the open country, and the closer I got to my new apartment, the lighter I felt. I thought about the people I'd meet, the stories I'd hear, and the change I might help build. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt like continuation. That evening, as I unpacked in the small studio the initiative had arranged for me, I found the painting I'd brought along wrapped carefully in brown paper. I hung it on the wall across from the bed. The image of Gate B6 seemed to glow softly in the lamplight, the brushstrokes alive with memory. I sat back and whispered, "You didn't just raise a granddaughter, you raised a witness. You raised a fighter." Outside the city buzzed faintly a hum of new beginnings, and somewhere between that sound and the soft light in the room, I knew she'd never really left. She'd just walked through her own gate and left it open for me to follow. The next morning I woke early, made coffee, and opened my laptop to begin training for the initiative. The first file on the screen read, "Elder Rights and Advocacy Protecting the Voices That Built Us." I smiled because I already knew the voice that had built mine, and as the day began, I whispered into the quiet, "All right, Grandma, let's get to work." The first few months at the Elder Justice Initiative moved faster than I expected. My schedule filled with intake calls, field visits, and training sessions, each story a reminder of why I'd chosen this path. The office sat in an old brick building near the river, its hallways lined with framed photographs of advocates who had come before us, people who'd built laws, fought silence, and won small victories that changed lives. On my first morning, Janet from the Boise Center called to wish me luck. "You'll be great," she said. "Just remember what brought you there." I promised I would. I settled into the rhythm quickly. The team was small but determined: 4 case managers, 2 investigators, and a senior attorney named Michael Pierce, who reminded me of Victor in his quiet way. Michael became my mentor patient, and exacting guiding me through reports that often blurred together. "Every case looks like paperwork until you find the human thread," he said, once tapping the file in front of me. "That's where justice starts." I thought of Grandma, then how she'd taught me to look beneath the surface of people's actions, to listen to what wasn't said. One case stayed with me more than the others. It involved an older man named Arthur McNeil, a retired mechanic from Idaho Falls. His niece had taken over his accounts, promising to help manage his bills, but she'd drained nearly everything over 2 years. When we visited his apartment, he offered us weak coffee and spoke so gently it made my throat tighten. "I just didn't want to cause trouble," he said. I saw my grandmother in the lines of his face, the same mix of weariness and grace. After we left, I sat in the car and watched the rain streak across the windshield, realizing I wasn't just processing a case, I was reliving what we'd lived through, but from the other side. Our work with Arthur led to the niece's arrest for financial exploitation and the recovery of part of his savings. When he signed the restitution agreement, his hands shook. "You didn't just get my money back," he said. "You gave me back my say." Those words stayed with me for weeks. Every night when I walked back to my apartment, I'd glance at Grandma's painting Gate B6 hanging by the window, its soft colors catching the streetlight. It felt like she was there reminding me that small wins mattered. By early winter, the program expanded, and Michael asked if I'd speak at a community forum in Boise about elder protection. The idea made me nervous, but he smiled. "You have something the rest of us don't, a personal story that proves this work matters." I spent nights preparing my notes, going over each line until I could recite it without looking. When the day came, I stood in front of a room filled with caregivers, lawyers, and seniors. The microphone hummed as I adjusted it. "My name is Grace Whitman," I began, "and a few years ago, someone I love was taken advantage of by her own family. She taught me that silence is a form of surrender, and we don't have to surrender anymore." The words weren't rehearsed. They came from somewhere deeper. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment before the applause began. Afterward, an older woman hugged me with tears in her eyes. "You just told my story," she said. That was the first time I realized Grandma's fight had become something larger than either of us. That evening after the event, I called Victor to tell him about it. He laughed softly. "You're making your mark, Grace. Your grandmother would be thrilled." I told him about the woman who'd hugged me, how her gratitude felt like closure I hadn't known I still needed. "That's the power of truth," he said. "It travels farther than we ever expect." Over the holidays, I went back to Meridian to spend a week in Grandma's house. It was my first time returning since I'd moved. The air smelled faintly of cedar and lemon cleaner, and the tulip bed lay dormant under a blanket of frost. I lit the fireplace and sat by the window with a cup of tea just as she used to. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore, it was grounding. On Christmas morning, I found an envelope tucked inside one of her sketchbooks. The handwriting stopped me cold. It was hers. The note was short, for when you forget how far you've come. "Keep walking through the gate, sweetheart. Love, Grandma." I held it for a long time before tucking it into my wallet. Back at work in January, I threw myself into a new project, an initiative to educate small-town banks about detecting elder fraud. The memory of Susan, the bank manager who'd helped Grandma, guided me through the process. We designed training materials, scheduled workshops, and built a hotline partnership with local branches. When the first call came in, it was from a teller in Twin Falls who'd stopped a man from withdrawing his mother's retirement fund under suspicious circumstances. "Your training saved her account," she said. That night, I walked home through falling snow, feeling like I'd honored Grandma's legacy in the most practical way possible. As months passed, life found a rhythm that felt steady and full. I kept in touch with Janet, who told me Eleanor's son had resurfaced and repaid part of what he owed after intervention from local authorities. She laughed when she said, "Guess you started something bigger than you realized." I smiled at the thought. Grandma always believed small acts could ripple wider than we imagined. In late March, I received a letter addressed simply to Ms. G. Whitman. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. Inside was a short message written on lined paper. "We heard about your work. I hope you can forgive us someday. Daniel and Evelyn, my father and mother," and no return address, no apology, just those few words. I stared at it for a long time before folding it neatly and placing it in the same drawer where Grandma had once kept her unanswered letters. It wasn't anger that made me do it, it was clarity. Some things belonged to the past. The next morning I woke early and walked down to the river before work. The air was cold and the water moved slow under a thin layer of mist. I thought about Grandma, how she'd faced betrayal with grace, how she'd rebuilt herself from disappointment into peace. For the first time, I understood that forgiveness didn't always mean reconnection. Sometimes it meant letting go without bitterness. When I returned to the office, Michael stopped me in the hallway. "There's talk of promoting you," he said with a grin. "The initiative wants you to lead a new outreach division next year." I laughed, caught off guard. "Me?" He nodded. "You've earned it. You have your grandmother's spine." That night I called Janet to share the news. She'd be proud, she said. "You've turned her story into a movement." After we hung up, I sat by the window looking out over the city lights. The painting of Gate B6 hung above my desk, and I traced its outline with my eyes, the open path, the glow beyond it. I whispered, "We did it, Grandma." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain through the cracked window. I imagined the tulips back home, starting to push through the thawing soil, reaching for light they couldn't yet see. And I knew without question that she'd planted more than flowers that spring. She'd planted a legacy strong enough to outlast both pain and time. As I turned off the lamp, the room dimmed to a soft amber glow. The gate in the painting seemed to shimmer its path, endless waiting. I smiled, knowing the story wasn't over. It was only opening into something new. The following spring, everything in my life seemed to bloom at once. The initiative expanded its outreach program, and I was officially promoted to director. My new office overlooked the river, and each morning I'd arrive early, coffee in hand, to watch the sunlight break across the water. The pace was demanding meetings, case reviews, press briefings, but it never felt heavy. It felt earned. Every achievement felt like a step forward from the day Grandma stood at that airport gate, clutching an empty envelope and still choosing grace. I visited Meridian whenever I could. The house remained just as she left it, quiet, full of light. The tulip beds were alive again, bright yellow and soft cream, crowding against the fence line. I hired a local gardener, Tom Reyes, to help keep them trimmed, but he said he barely needed to. "They come back strong on their own," he told me, smiling. I knelt down, touching the petals gently. "She'd like that," I said. He nodded. Whoever planted them, they knew how to give roots something to hold on to. That week I spent my evenings cleaning out her attic. Dust floated through the slanted sunlight as I sorted through boxes of photos, school papers, and old lesson plans from her teaching days. In one box, wrapped carefully in tissue, I found a stack of letters. The envelopes were addressed to me, dated over several years, though I'd never received them. Some were postmarked but never delivered. Others were unsent. My name was written in Grandma's careful handwriting. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the scent of cedar and old paper, and began to read. The first few were simple holiday greeting stories from her garden notes about her painting class, but the later ones were deeper, written in the months after the lawsuit. She'd written about learning to live with disappointment, about forgiveness, not being a gift for others, but a way to keep peace alive inside yourself. One line stopped me completely. "I hope you never lose the fire that made you fight for me, but I hope it never burns away your softness." I pressed the paper to my chest, her voice echoing in every word. Downstairs, the late afternoon light slanted through the windows, scattering across her old teacups lined neatly in the cabinet. I brewed a pot just like she always did, 2 spoonfuls steeped exactly 4 minutes, and sat on the porch. Across the yard, the tulips swayed gently in the wind, the same color she loved most, bright yellow, the color of hope. For the first time since her passing, I didn't feel her absence as an ache. It felt like presence, quiet, certain everywhere. 2 weeks later, I was invited to speak at the state capitol for an elder protection reform hearing. Our initiative had helped draft new legislation that would increase penalties for financial exploitation and establish a statewide education fund for victims' support. As I stood behind this podium, the microphones blinking red, I glanced at the rows of people, advocates, legislators, journalists. Michael sat in the front row, nodding encouragingly. When it was my turn, I told Grandma's story not as tragedy, but as testament. She believed that peace and justice could live side by side, I said. And she taught me that protecting someone's dignity is the truest form of love. When the session ended, a lawmaker approached me, Senator Carter, a tall woman with a steady gaze. "You've done something rare," she said. "You turned grief into policy." I thanked her quietly, knowing the words weren't mine alone. That night, I received a message from Victor. She'd be proud, Grace. You've made her legacy into something lasting. The following month, the bill passed unanimously. The news outlets called it a victory for elder justice reform, but to me, it was a promise kept. The program was renamed the Lillian Whitman Protection Act, and when the governor signed it, I stood beside him holding a framed photograph of Grandma, her smiling in the garden sunlight on her shoulders. Cameras flashed, but I barely noticed. All I could think of was that she'd once said she wanted peace, and somehow this was it. After the ceremony, I drove back to Meridian and stopped at her grave. The hill by the lake was green and quiet, the water glinting in the distance. I knelt beside her headstone and placed a fresh bouquet of tulips tied with a white ribbon. They used your name for the law, I whispered. It's going to help a lot of people, Grandma. The breeze stirred the grass soft and slow as if she were answering. I sat there for a while, watching the sun move across the water until the air turned cool and the lights softened into evening. Back home in Boise, I found myself looking at the painting of Gate B6 again. I'd seen it so many times it had become part of the background, but that night it looked different. The gate wasn't just half open anymore, it looked like it was waiting. I took it down, dusted the frame, and hung it above my desk at the initiative's office the next day. When my team asked about it, I said only, "It's where all of this began." Over the next few months, letters began arriving from people who had been helped by the new law. One came from a woman in Twin Falls whose daughter had stolen her savings but was now in recovery and making amends. Another from a retired teacher who'd avoided losing her pension after attending one of our workshops. Each story felt like a small seed taking root. I kept every letter in a folder labeled The Garden, a name that felt right somehow. In September, the initiative hosted its first annual fundraiser in Boise. We filled the community center with local artists, musicians, and advocates. I stood near the entrance greeting guests as they came in. Near the end of the evening, I noticed an older couple hovering by the doorway. It took a moment to recognize them, my parents. My mother's hair had grayed and my father looked smaller than I remembered. They approached quietly, almost hesitant. "Grace," my mother said, her voice trembling. "We saw the article in the paper. About the law. It's incredible." My father nodded, his hands clasped. "You've done something good. For her. For all of us." The words hung there, uncertain but sincere. I met their eyes and simply said, "Thank you." We stood in silence for a long time, the kind that carried both history and hesitation. Then I said, "There's coffee and pie in the back if you'd like some." They nodded, grateful for the invitation, even if it was only a small step. When the event ended, I walked them to the door. My father turned before leaving. "She'd be proud of you," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to find words. As they left, I felt something inside me loosen, not forgiveness exactly, but the release that comes when you finally stop expecting more. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stayed behind to tidy up the tables. The lights dimmed to a warm glow, and soft music played over the speakers. On the stage sat a single vase of tulips from the centerpiece, yellow, of course. I carried them outside and set them by the building's steps. The air was cool, the sky streaked with the last traces of sunset. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of what was lost. I felt the quiet strength of what remained. As I locked up and turned toward the parking lot, the wind lifted lightly around me, carrying the scent of fresh rain. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, marking the hour. I thought of Grandma's voice, soft but certain, saying, "Keep blooming." And standing there beneath that fading sky, I realized I had. The night air settled calm and still, and I walked to my car, ready for whatever came next. The year after the law passed felt like the closing of a long circle. The garden behind Grandma's house had grown wild in my absence, yet somehow still beautiful. Tom the gardener said the tulips kept spreading each spring, their bulbs multiplying beneath the soil. I liked that the idea of something growing quietly even after its keeper was gone. Every visit I'd walk that fence line with my hands brushing the petals the way she once did. It felt like greeting her. The Lillian Whitman Protection Act began to make real change. Reports increased not because abuse was rising, but because people finally had the courage to speak. The initiative launched a scholarship for social work students focusing on elder advocacy, and the first recipient, a young woman named Allie Harper, sent me a handwritten letter. She wrote, "Your grandmother's name is now the first one we learn in class." I sat at my desk, tears catching behind my eyes, thinking about how Grandma's soft voice had once carried further than she ever imagined. By autumn, my days were full meetings, training sessions, traveling to small towns to help set up new community programs. Yet every night when I came home, I'd switch on the lamp by the window, and its light would spill across the painting of Gate B6. I'd stop for a moment to look at it before bed. That simple image had followed me through every turn of this journey, a gate half open, a path fading into gold. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It had become a promise that no matter how painful a beginning, there could still be peace waiting somewhere ahead. That December, the initiative hosted a quiet dinner to honor the team that helped pass the law. Victor came in from Boise, still carrying that calm energy that made people listen. Michael was there too, along with Janet and a few others who'd believed in the cause from the start. We shared a toast to Grandma's legacy. When it was my turn to speak, I said, "She once told me peace isn't what you wait for, it's what you build." Tonight, I think we've built a piece of hers. The room fell silent, and for a brief moment, I felt her presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. After everyone left, I stayed behind to blow out the candles. Outside, the streets were quiet, the kind of stillness that only winter brings. The reflection of the lights shimmered against the window, and I thought about how far we'd come from that day at the airport to this night of calm victory. Justice hadn't erased the pain, but it had restored something deeper dignity for her and for all the others who had been silenced. A few weeks later, I went back to the house one last time before the year ended. I decided to keep it not as a monument, but as a place for new beginnings. It would become a community center for elder rights education with free legal clinics once a month. The living room where she used to sketch would hold long tables and coffee cups instead of art supplies, but I knew she'd approve. She always said the house should stay full of life. As I stood in the doorway, looking at the light falling through the windows, I realized how different everything felt. The silence was no longer heavy. It was steady, peaceful, like the sound of rest after a long road. I walked through each room one more time, touching the backs of chairs, the cool edge of the piano, the worn railing by the stairs. Every corner held echoes of her laughter and the lessons she left behind. Out by the garden, the ground was bare, the tulip bulbs sleeping under the frost. I knelt beside the fence, brushed away the layer of snow, and whispered, "They'll be back soon." The wind carried my breath away soft and sure. It always did. When I drove off that evening, the sun was setting behind the fields. The sky was the same color as the tulips in spring gold and tender. I realized something simple. Then legacy isn't about what we keep, it's about what we give forward. Grandma had given me courage, and I'd passed it on piece by piece until it belonged to many. Now, years later, her painting still hangs in my office. People often ask about it during meetings, and I always tell them it's a reminder of where strength begins with one act of quiet defiance, one choice to stand beside someone instead of walking away. I think that's the part of her that lives in me most deeply. Sometimes, on long evenings, I'll step outside and look toward the horizon. The wind always smells faintly of rain, and I hear her voice in it, steady, kind, unwavering. "Keep blooming, Grace," she says. And I do. I always will. If you've listened this far, take a moment to think about the people who shaped you, the ones who believed in your worth when others didn't. Tell their stories, protect their dignity. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Because hope, just like those tulips, always finds its way back to the light.